very excited to be here. So I'm Alex He from University of Maryland, and this is joint work with Tanya Babina, Sabrina Howe, Elizabeth Perman, and Joseph Stout. And in this project, we're interested in how different funding sources affect university researchers. And the term color of money is borrowed from the jargon of the government agency regarding the funding appropriations. And here we mean where the money is from, whether it's from the federal government or from the private firms. So this project uses the data from US Census Bureau, and all the results have been carefully reviewed to make sure that there's no confidential information revealed in this presentation. So the broad motivation for this project is that there is an aggregate shift from the federal to private industry funding for R&D in the US. So this is data from NSF, and you can see that since the 2000, the share of federal R&D has declined from 60% to about 45%. And at the same time, the share of R&D from the private firms have increased from 20 to 30%. And the share of funding from other sources has remained steady. So the decline in federal R&D funding has largely been compensated by this increase in private industry funding. And this is true for all the R&D, but also true for the university R&D as well. So in the past, university researchers get almost all of their funding from the federal government, but now they also get a large proportion from the private industry. And this leads us to ask, does this shift in the funding sources matter for the R&D outcomes? And we focus on the university setting for a number of reasons. First, we have detailed data on the university researchers and their funding composition, and I'll talk more about this later. But more importantly, universities are an engine of innovation, and it's crucial for the economic growth as documented in the previous studies. And it's pivotal to the production of the human capital and also to training the next generation of researchers and innovators. And if a change in the funding sources affect university researchers' outcomes, that could also shed light on the impact of funding sources in general, but also it's important on its own because of the important role that universities play in innovation. Now, what are the mechanisms for the funding sources to affect the innovation? So one view is that as long as it's the same amount of money, where it is from does not matter. And all the research in this literature so far has been focusing on the level of funding. So it could very well be the case that the main R&D challenge is underinvestment. So the level of funding is the only thing that we should care about. However, there are also a number of channels for the funding sources to matter as well, conditional on the amount of funding. So first, one type of funding might be more productive than the other. So for example, one type of funding could have better monitoring or providing better guidance to the researchers, or just give the researchers more freedom to pursue whatever projects they want. And this is analogous to a child having a better teacher. And in this case, that funding could lead to more research outputs in general, like more patents and more startups. And second, different types of funding may prefer different types of research. In particular, one might suspect that federal funding encourages researchers to work on more basic projects, and the industry funding encourages more applied projects. So in this case, the more applied projects could lead to higher commercializable outputs, such as patents and startups, but more basic projects could lead to more important innovations and likely reflected in highly cited or more original patents. And last but not the least, different types of funding may also be different in terms of appropriating the research outcome. And if the research output is more open, then it will lead to more widely used, and in other words, more general patents, and also more startups because it's easier to be used by the researcher themselves. On the other hand, appropriated research can lead to more patents, especially patents that's assigned to the funder, and more career shifts to the funder firms and less startups. So these three channels are not mutually exclusive, and in reality, it could all be going on. But in our data, the evidence is most consistent with the third appropriation channel. So we find that federal funding yields more widely used and more general patents. and more high-tech startups by the researchers and seems to be more open. Whereas private funding leads to more patents, and they're more often assigned to the funder firms, and also more career shifts to the incumbent firms. So it's consistent with it's being more appropriated. So to introduce our data sets, I think it would be useful to think about, to have our research design in mind. So in our main specification, we will have the researchers' share of federal or private funding on the right-hand side, and then the innovation outcomes and career outcomes on the left-hand side. So the right-hand side variables will come from the Institute for Research in Innovation and Science at the University of Michigan, and they collect the data from the universities on the amount of funding from each source for every researcher in every month. And the data we use in this paper covers 22 research universities in the US, and that include like large public universities like University of Michigan, and also private universities like Princeton. So for each grant, we observe all of the individuals being paid on the grant. And that includes faculty and graduate students, which are the largest proportion of our data, but also there are some undergraduate and staff. In our sample, about 82% of the funding comes from the federal government, and 11% is from the private firms, and 7% is from other sources like state government or university. We then linked all of these researchers to inventors in the USPTO dataset to get the patent outcomes. And we also linked them to the census LEHD and LBD, and also the IRS W-2 forms to get a complete working history of the researchers. And that include their income when they're paid as a student. And in particular, for the entrepreneurship outcomes, we identify the high-tech entrepreneurship. If a person is in a firm in the first year that firm is established, and that firm is in the high-tech sector. So the main empirical challenge in this paper is that the funding sources are endogenous. And researchers can select into different types of funding. For example, those who do more applied work may prefer the industry funding, and the very top researchers might prefer the more prestigious federal grants like the NSF. And also different funders could also select different types of researchers and projects. So to address this endogeneity issue, we instrument for the researchers' share of federal funding with the aggregate shocks to the federal funding within narrow fields of study. So we got from the single audit data set on the amount of funding by narrow fields of study, and these are called the Cfta programs. And there are about 500 Cfta programs that the researchers in our sample get their funding from. And the data allows us to measure the shocks to federal funding within each narrow field. And this specifically affects the researchers in those fields. So here are two examples of the Cfta programs. So the top figure is one program called Cardiovascular Diseases Research. And you can see that it has a big spike in 2005. And then the bottom figure is agricultural research, which has a downward spike in 2009. And both of these shocks are very temporary, and they actually very quickly revert to the mean afterwards. And this is the shocks that we will be using for our IV. And the identification assumption is that conditional on the controls, the shocks to the aggregate funding are uncorrelated with the errors in individual research outcomes. And these shocks are at the aggregate level, so they are uncorrelated with the individual researcher's ability or preferences. And they're also temporary and mean reverting, so it does not really reflect the technological opportunities in the certain fields. And we do a lot of tests to roll that out, and if I have time, I will talk about those later. And we also do several tests that are commonly done for the Bardic style IV. So for example, we look at the pre-trends before the shocks, and we don't see any pre-trends in the innovation outcomes before the shocks happen. think to understand our IV, it would be helpful to also understand where the funding shocks are coming from. So unlike many other countries, the US does not have a national innovation strategy. And each agency has a committee that's dedicated to it. And the interests of the members of these congressional committees are very important. In particular, they often have a desire to bring the money home. So what we see is a wide area of earmarks and other specific funding directives, which are with research funds often included in entirely unrelated legislation. So to give you a few examples of the sausage making, so we see, for example, that there is often more money earmarked than is provided in additional funding for a given agency, so that they wind up increasing in one area and reducing another. And we see things like the Parkinson's disease research spiking as a result of congressmen dying from the Parkinson's, and also Alzheimer's research funding increased because of the Missouri senator wants to allocate funds to WashU in Missouri, which does most of the Alzheimer's research. And the Trump administration has persistently cut the R&D funding for all the agencies except the DoD, whereas increasing the DoD funding by 13%. As a result, the EPA's R&D budget declined by 42%. So obviously that's not related to the technological opportunities in the environmental research. So a lot of these funding shocks are usually due to idiosyncratic and often political reasons. So therefore, they are mostly exogenous to the researchers' innovation outcomes. Now this is our IV specification. So in the second stage, we were regressing the individual's innovation outcomes in year T on the lagged share of federal funding. And then in the first stage, we regressed the share of federal funding on the lagged changes in the total federal expenditures within the researcher's Cfta program. So these are the federal funding shocks. And in both stages, we control for the log level of funding. So the exclusion restriction is that conditional on the amount of funding, the federal funding shocks only affect the innovation outcomes through the shares. And we also control for the university department and field fixed effects so that we're only comparing people within the same department. The first stage is very strong with an F-stat of above 100. And this means that when there is a positive shock to the federal funding, the researchers will get a larger proportion of their funding from the federal government and less from the private sources. As with NAIV, the effect we're measuring is identified from the compliers. So these are the people who would be forced to switch their funding sources when the supply of the funding, when the supply of the federal funding shifts. So for example, suppose that student A is doing cardiovascular research and then experienced a negative shock in that field in the year that he entered the PhD. And then that student went on to get industry funding. And in comparison, student B in the same cohort but working in a different field, or student C that's in the same field but a different cohort, they did not experience that negative shock, so they went on to get federal funding. So that's the comparison that we are identifying the effects from. And in particular, we do not have the individual fixed effects here, so that we're comparing across people, not within people. And this is the reason is that most of our sample are students, so we only observe their funding for a short period of time. And within that time, they usually don't switch funding sources that often. Okay, so now let me turn to the results. So we first conduct an event study by looking at the changes around large and temporary negative shocks to federal funding as the one I showed before in the researcher's Cfta codes. And this allows us to see the effects over time. And this graph is like the first stage, which shows the changes in the share of federal and private funding over time around these shocks. So when there's a negative shock to the federal funding, we see that the share of federal funding declines and the share of private funding increases by almost the same amount. And this graph shows the reduced form of the patent outcomes. This is again around the large negative shocks to federal funding. And the top figure shows you a dummy for whether there is a patent. And the bottom figure is the number of patents. So in both figures, the number of patents increase after the negative shock to federal funding. And importantly, we don't see any pre-trend before the shock. This is again the first stage, but in the table. So the increase in federal funding is within the Cfta program is associated with an increase in the share of federal funding. And it's mostly compensated by a change in the share of private funding, and to a less degree, the share in other types of funding. And we also see that the 3 lags of the federal funding shocks all have an effect on the share of funding, but the largest effect is coming from the 1-year and 2-year lags. So we use those lags as the IV in our main specification.
Alex, sorry, just 1 second. There is a clarification question by Nordine. She asking whether the personal information on data grants link with available patent text that acknowledge the funding. So is the personal information on data grant linked with available patent text that acknowledge the funding?
Sorry, I did not understand that question. Could you repeat?
Nordine, can you directly ask the question? If you...
Yeah, sure. So it's not a she, it's a he, but that's okay.
Sorry.
No, I was just wondering, because you were saying that you're looking at outcomes. So how do you know that the patent derives from a particular research stream, a particular funding stream? How can you make this link? That was...
Okay, now I understand. So you're asking, how do I link the patents to specific projects?
Yeah.
We're not. So we are only looking at patents for the individuals. So all of these regressions is at the individual level. So we look at the funding composition of the individuals, and then we look at the patenting outcomes of the individuals. So individuals can get many grants, for example, and then we take aggregate all of that grants and see what fraction is coming from the federal, what fraction is coming from the private, and that's our independent variable. And then the patents of that individual is our dependent variable.
Okay, oh, it's clear now. Thank you.
Okay, so
you can go ahead.
So this table shows the estimates from the second stage regression for the patent outcomes. So column 1 shows that a 10% increase in the share of federal funding lowers the probability of having any patent by 46% of the mean. So that's a pretty big effect. And we find a similar effect in column 2 with the number of patents. And then from columns 3 to 5, we look at 3 measures of patent quality. So that's number of citations, originality, which measures whether a patent cites a wide range of fields, and generality, which measures whether a patent is being cited by a wide range of fields. And we find no effect on having patents that are highly cited, a slight negative effect on having patents with high originality, and a slight positive effect on having patents with high generality. And finally, in the last column, we find a very strong negative effect of having federal funding on patents that are assigned to private firms. And we also see among the patents that are assigned to private firms, 40% of them are being assigned to the funder firm, which is the firm that funds the research itself. And next, we look at the effect on entrepreneurship, which is another important measure of the innovation. So here's the event study again. So we see that after a federal funding cut in the researcher's field of study, there is a persistent decline in the high-tech entrepreneurship, which is the opposite direction of the patent's outcomes. And this table is the IV second stage for the career outcomes. So these are all constructed from the census. So these career outcomes usually are further lagged from when the funding is received. So we look at all the outcomes in the next 3 years after we observe the funding composition. So for example, the dependent variable in column 1 is whether a researcher starts a high-tech entrepreneurship between the year T and year T plus 2, after we observe their funding in year T minus 1. So what we find is that a 10% increase in share of federal funding increases the high-tech entrepreneurship by about 46 of the mean. And it also reduces the probability of working for an incumbent firm by about 8% of the mean, and increases the probability of working for the university by about 1.5% of the mean. So researchers who receive more of their funding from the federal sources is less likely to leave academia and join the private industry. We also see that among the people who work in any funder firm in the sample, 20% of them are actually working for the firm that funded their own research. So next we look at the share of the private funding as the independent variable, and we find exactly the opposite effects. So this is not mechanical because the share of federal funding and the share of private funding does not add up to 1, because there are other sources as well. But the results indicate that our results are mainly driven by a substitution between federal and private, and not other types of funding, like university or state government. And this is also consistent with the aggregate trends I showed at the beginning, that there's a decline in federal funding that's mainly compensated by an increase in private funding. And when splitting by the occupation, we find that the faculty and graduate students drive our patenting results, which is consistent with them being the primary impetus of the patent application decisions. And the graduate students and undergrads explain most of the high-tech entrepreneurship and career results, so consistent with them being a crucial juncture in their career. And I think this is relevant particularly for agencies who define their mission in part in terms of training and for understanding the role of universities in training future researchers. And we did a bunch of robustness tests in the paper to roll out the alternative explanations. First, we make sure that the results are not driven by the changes in funding levels. So with the controls of the funding amount or the changes in funding amount included, the funding shocks still have a similar effect on the innovation and career outcomes through the shares of the federal and private funding. And importantly, we see that a higher amount of funding actually increases patents and reduces entrepreneurship, which goes against our IV effects. So the amount of funding cannot drive the results that we see. And second, it could be that a negative shock to federal funding is a negative income shock to the researchers. But we show that the lower federal funds actually predicts higher income for the researchers using the census data. And finally, a concern is that the funding shocks may be correlated with new technological opportunities or other downstream policies, or it could reflect the long-term trends in federal funding and predicted by the researchers. But we find that the results are robust to using only large and temporary shocks and also robust to controlling for the long-term trends. And we also find no effect for people who always get 100% of the funding from the federal sources, although all of these factors can impact them as well. And we did a lot of other tests in the paper beyond this that I don't have it in the slides, but they all point to a causal interpretation of our effect of share of federal funding on the innovation and career outcomes. Now, what other mechanisms? So what we find is that a higher share of federal funding leads to fewer patents and more high-tech startups. So this is inconsistent with the productivity hypothesis, because if the federal funding is more productive, then it should lead to more patents and more startups. It's also inconsistent with the basic versus applied story, because if the private funding pushes the researchers to do more applied work, then this would have more commercializable outputs, including patents and startups. And if the federal funding is more basic, then we should see that it yields more highly cited and more original patents, which we don't really find. However, our results are most consistent with the appropriation story, that the federal funding is more open and the private funding leads to research output being appropriated by the funder. So in practice, it's common for industry funders to have the rights of first refusal, complex non-disclosure agreements, and control over the direction of research. And we collect some actual industry university contracts from the university funding offices to present evidence that's consistent with this. So for example, this text is from a contract between the NYU Langone Medical School and an industry funder. And it says that companies shall have and retain all right, title, and interest in and to the results. And institution, which is NYU, here assigns to the company all of its right, title, and interest to and in and to the results. All information regarding the results shall be confidential information of the company. Company hereby grants to the institution a limited, non-exclusive, and fully paid license to use the results for its internal academic, research, and educational purposes. So these are very common in the industry contracts. However, for federal funding, there are much fewer strings attached, and there's no restrictions like the one we see at all. So the IP is freer to go to the startups that's funded by the researchers. One famous example of this is Larry Page and Sergey Brin's work on PageRank algorithm in 1994, which was funded by a federal grant to Stanford. And then they took the patent to be the core intellectual property asset for Google. Okay, so I think I will end a little bit early here, but I'll just let Hans to have more time to discuss. So to conclude, this is, to our knowledge, the first causal analysis of the effect of the federal versus private funding on university researchers' innovation and career outcomes. So we find that a higher instrumented share of federal funding predicts fewer but more general patents, more high-tech startups, higher likelihood of being in academia, and lower likelihood of joining an incumbent firm. So we conclude that federal and private funding are not perfect substitutes, and federal research appears to be more open and less appropriated by the funder. And this could have implications for the innovation and the training of students as we see more funding that's shifting from the federal to private sources. Thank you so much. I'm excited to hear Hans's comments.